This is my research inquiry project final step, and it's a TED Talk basically called Spring Awakening and Why We Need Deaf People in Theater. So as of 3 years ago, I'm an uncle to 3 beautiful kids from 2 sides of my family. And as an uncle, I feel like it's my duty to introduce them to as much cool stuff as I possibly can before my cool uncle card gets revoked. And as much as I'd like all 3 of these kids to understand how amazing theater is, I know that for 2 of them, theater is largely inaccessible. Oakland and Talissa, my sister-in-law's kids, are fully deaf. While there are wonderful theater companies like the National Theater of the Deaf and programs like those at Gallaudet University, mainstream theater is entirely hearing. Musicals are the most popular and recognized form of theater, and they're everywhere. They're on TV, on the news, and in talk shows. They're on YouTube, they're on TikTok, they're in your toilet, they're everywhere. But musicals are incredibly inaccessible. Not only do Broadway tickets average $116.34 a pop, according to New York ticket sales analysis, but as of right now, there's a shortage of sign language interpreters in the US, especially since the start of the pandemic. While I'd love to introduce my niece and nephew to theater, I know that I'd have to jump through a lot of hoops and pay a lot of money just for them to even be able to attend a show. And that's frustrating because even then, theaters rarely recognize disabilities in their shows, especially deafness. Disability-accessible theaters are few and far between, and despite the demands of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, the accommodations provided by theaters are often lacking. The Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination, quote, on the basis of disability in employment, state and local government, public accommodations, commercial facilities, transportation, and telecommunications. For public buildings like theaters, Title III declares, quote, public accommodations must comply with basic non-discrimination requirements that prohibit exclusion, segregation, and unfair treatment. They also must comply with specific requirements related to architectural standards for new and altered buildings, reasonable modifications to policies, practices, and procedures, effective communication with people with hearing, vision, or speech disabilities, and other access requirements. So by law, theaters are required to provide accommodations and properly communicate with deaf and hard of hearing patrons. Accommodations include open or closed captioning, providing a sign language interpreter, and assistive hearing systems. But these accommodations aren't always the best in quality or even available by request. For hard of hearing moviegoers like Ali Serd, closed captioning devices are unreliable. Serd has said, quote, I go to customer service and they never really do anything. They just throw free movie tickets at me. This doesn't really solve any problems, I just let them go to waste. As far as theaters like this one, sign language interpreters are given very little planning time between a couple days and a couple weeks. And performing arts interpreters in particular are not required to have an acting degree. As New York interpreter Linda Callis explains, quote, if an interpreter does not have a passion for live performance art, they will not be able to provide deaf consumers with the access these patrons deserve. When a performing arts interpreter gets fatigued, their performance starts lacking, meaning they will not be able to provide deaf audience members with an equal theatrical experience, meaning these conditions are not certified under the ADA. Now, directors in the past have had the brilliant idea to have the performers on stage use ASL rather than hire an interpreter. Of course, deaf theater companies have been doing this for decades, like Gallaudet University's theater programs, which date back to the 1860s. But deaf theater and the use of sign language on stage has barely made a dent in the world of mainstream theater. That is, with the exception of Deaf West's production of Spring Awakening. Deaf West Spring Awakening debuted on Broadway at the Brooks Atkinson Theater on September 27th, 2015, and it revolutionized the way I saw theater. Firstly, it was directed by Michael Arden, who originated the role of Quasimodo in the US musical The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which we'll get to, don't worry. But he also decided the entire show would be signed at ASL. Secondly, he hired 6 deaf actors, and 2 of them were leading characters, Daniel Durant as Moritz and Sandra Frank as Wendla. Thirdly, each deaf actor was paired with a hearing actor who acted as basically the voice of that character. So the deaf actor would sign the dialogue and lyrics, and the hearing actor would say what they were signing. This show went absolutely nuts on the internet because of the signing, and it was fantastic. Actors like Joshua Castile, who played Ernst, actually used the momentum of the show's success to start future projects. And the lead, Austin McKenzie, actually started his musical career because of Spring Awakening. He started as a sign language interpreter for the deaf actors on set, and Michael Arden saw him signing and singing and cast him as the lead. The rehearsal process for Spring Awakening was intense and grueling, but so incredibly fruitful in the end. There were hundreds of rehearsals, which involved multiple sign language interpreters, but also dozens of visual cues used by the deaf actors to keep the flow of the show. For example, Daniel Durant as Moritz in the song And Then There Were None relied on another cast member to remove his hand from the bedpost Durant was standing on in order to know when to tear up a letter he had been holding. These visual cues also helped deaf people in the audience understand when the song started and ended. So all around, the show is more accessible than having sign language interpreters present at every show. Not to dunk on sign language interpreters, but the point of theater is to tell a story to as many people as possible. If one method of communication works better than the other, even if it's harder to do, it'll work out better in the end, and it did for this show. My main takeaway from Deaf West Spring Awakening was representation. It was great seeing sign language on the stage, but it mattered more to me that there were deaf actors up there getting the recognition they deserve. Oakland and Talissa aren't my only deaf family members. My stepbrother Dakota is deaf, and his wife, my sister-in-law Heidi, is hard of hearing. I learned ASL to communicate with them, but it's hard to communicate my love of theater when people like them aren't represented on stage. Spring Awakening made that happen. Even some of the characters were rewritten to be deaf. Vendla's doctor accidentally calls Vendla a whore when he's talking about a medical procedure she's about to endure that will supposedly feel like a nice, relaxing spa day. Oof. Moritz is scolded during school for signing instead of speaking, and this instance actually comes from deaf history. After the Civil War, schools started refusing manualism, which is using sign language to communicate, and replaced it with oralism, the use of lip reading and speech. Oralism was backed by eugenics. Some people feared the encouragement of sign language would lead to deaf people marrying other deaf people and having deaf children, which, quote, set them apart, discouraged assimilation, and encouraged discrimination, according to PBS. Spring Awakening alone is a beautiful story that speaks out against censorship, parental expectations, the education system, abortion, queer issues. But including deafness as part of the story, instead of just a trait of the actors, adds a new emotional layer. It gives the story historical context and the characters an altered sense of agency. And this extra layer is exactly what my directors did and included when I starred in The Hunchback of Notre Dame last February. Doing Hunchback was different from doing Spring Awakening in many ways, obviously. For one, our cast was entirely hearing, so we didn't have much deaf influence and expertise when it came to modifying the story of The Hunchback of Notre Dame to feature elements of deaf culture. We did hire a sign language interpreter, Bunny Berg, who actually worked with my stepbrother Dakota back when he went to school here at Centennial. We started working with Bunny in June of 2019 through sign language clinics, where we learned the basics of ASL before we were even cast in the show. Bunny helped us translate most of the script and most of the songs into ASL and taught us the signs. It took months of preparation and practice and perfection and a lot of ibuprofen because our hands were practically crumbling at that point to ensure that Quasimodo's deafness and ASL was properly portrayed on the stage. One of the most obvious expressions of Quasimodo's deafness is the way he interacts with Frollo, his caregiver and uncle, and Esmeralda, a beautiful girl he meets when he escapes from the bell tower. In rehearsals, director LaDonna Wilson instructed these actors for these roles to treat Quasimodo differently to show a dichotomy. Frollo is brutal and tries to strip away parts of Quasimodo's identity so he feels like a monster. Esmeralda is kind and patient and tries to uplift his self-esteem so he feels more like a man. Frollo is an oralist and grabs Quasimodo's hands and forces him to lip read. Esmeralda is a manualist and tries to learn sign language to understand him. This was the added layer that we slipped in. Just like Moritz and Wendla's deafness, they slipped into Spring Awakening. Hunchback is already about a disabled man trying to be understood in a world that refuses to recognize him as a human being. Adding in his deafness just adds an emotional layer to his story and gets the audience to understand his frustration and his resilience even more. I had the most ASL experience in the cast because I learned it from my brother. So Bunny Berg, our interpreter, basically made me her little assistant, and I practiced with the actors when she was busy. It was so interesting to see these 50 or so teenagers learn to sign. With any new verbal language you learn, usually you'll overdo the pronunciation and try to make your accent sound authentic. But with ASL, it's all muscle memory. Your fingers have accents, your wrists deliver the proper grammar. Whenever we were in rehearsal and learning new signs, I just liked watching people's faces because you could tell they had never made their hand in a certain position before or moved it in a certain direction. And nearly everyone would overdo the signs, but it was fine because we were on the stage and we were trying to get the person at the back of the room to understand what we were signing. But I'd be having a one-on-one discussion with an actor and they'd say, so when we sign Belle, do we sign it like this? And I'd say, I don't know, when you talk to someone, do you talk like this? ASL in conversation is a lot different from ASL on the stage, and this problem came up a lot in rehearsal. Bunny Berg wasn't entirely familiar with theatrical culture from what I gathered, and of course her experience in the deaf community often clashed with the culture of the theater. And of course it would. The overlap between the deaf community and the musical theater world is incredibly small. But as someone who fits inside that tiny overlap, I was able to bridge the gap, sort of, and translate her ideas and teachings into musical theater language. One of the main difficulties we faced during rehearsals was trying to get the cast to sign in sync for the larger numbers. I remember we were learning the finale, and Bunny was standing at a podium in front of the entire cast, signing along as we listened to a recording of the song. And everyone was trying to follow her, but she signed it a little differently every time we reviewed it, so it started to fall apart. At one point, I raised my hand and I said, hey, I got an idea, I think I know how to fix this. And so I went up with my script, and I held up my hand, I signed watch me, and the recording started again. Instead of signing the way Bunny would as an interpreter, I signed the lyrics as they came in the song. The movements were on the beats, and the flow matched the very choral, hymn-like singing. And everyone started to copy my movements, and before we were even halfway done, everyone was in sync. Bunny was trying to teach musical theater through an interpreter's brain. I took a different approach and interpreted with a musical theater brain, and it worked. And that's how we did rehearsals from then on. Bunny would teach the signs, and everyone would look to me for when the lyrics were supposed to be signed in relation to the music. It made more sense to sign the way you would sing the lyrics because of the medium. Songs are meant to express feelings to a beat, therefore everything that you do with a song should be done to the beat. That's why watching a dancer get offbeat is so agonizing, because they're expressing themselves, but not at the same time the music is expressing itself. So the expression doesn't match with the song, and it doesn't work. It'd be like if I said, Shawty had them apple-bottom jeans, boots with the fur. The whole club was looking at her. She hit the floor, and next thing you know, Shawty got low, 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 low. The message doesn't get across in the same way that it would if I actually sang that. These rehearsals, combined with the beauty and execution of Spring Awakening, led me to sort of construct what I believe is the future of musical theater. And those are bold words coming from a 17-year-old, but it's true. I'd like to introduce you to the concept of theatrical sign language. Theatrical sign language is a term that I coined that is less of a language and more of a formula or set of guidelines to follow if you want to theatrically sign a show. Kind of like how in English we have British, Scottish, American, Canadian, New York, New Jersey, all these accents. People all over the world speak English, but in many different ways. So TSL is to ASL as a British accent is to the English language. Translating anything to the stage involves exaggeration. You have to make sure everyone in the audience can see and hear what you're doing. Dance is just exaggerated movements to a beat. Singing is just exaggerated speaking. So when you translate sign language to the stage, it has to be exaggerated in order to reach all corners of the audience. The signs will have to be bigger and slower most of the time. American Sign Language is linguistically unique in that it's missing a couple words that we have in English. There's no the and it, or basically any filler words. Sign language is designed to be as direct and almost as blunt as possible, which is why some deaf people can come across as mean to hearing people, because deaf people don't sugarcoat anything. If a hearing person gets the wrong order in a restaurant, we go, "I'm so sorry, I think there's something wrong with my order. Can you maybe check with the chef in the back and make sure they made it correctly? Thank you so much, I'm so sorry." A deaf person would just go, "Hey, my order's wrong. Can you remake it for me, please? Thank you so much." So when we translate a script to the stage, hearing actors might get confused because the translations might have fewer words than the original script, or the words will be different altogether. For example, in the song Out There from Hunchback, Quasimodo sings, "Out there among the millers and the weavers and their wives, through the roofs and gables I can see them." In sign language, we translated that to out there, townspeople, buildings, roofs, look around. A regular interpretation of the song would finish those signs far before the singer would finish the phrase, and the signs would be very close to the body and not very big. That's one of the main differences between TSL and ASL. The window for signing has to be increased. In ASL, usually the window is about a forearm's length wide and from about your waist to your head. For TSL, it has to expand for visibility, so the window becomes more like about 2 forearms long and from your hips to about 6 inches above your head. In theatrical sign language, we would also lengthen the amount of time it takes to sign the signs, so the signs finish at the same time as the lyrics. And the signs would be a lot bigger so that everyone could see them. It looked like, "Out there among the millers and the weavers and their wives, through the roofs and gables I can see them." Similarly with music, signing to the beat of the song makes more sense for learning it and performing it. Your muscle memory will be better than if you signed it literally as if there wasn't music. For more lyrical songs, like "I'm Here" from The Color Purple, signing more freely is okay. But for songs like "Satisfied" from Hamilton, songs that rely heavily on the speed or the tempo of the song need to be signed on the beat in order to maintain the flow or energy of the song. The opening number to Hunchback is a great example of this. With Hunchback, we went from "Morning, Paris, city, wake up, Notre Dame, bells" to "Morning in Paris, the city awakes to the bells of Notre Dame." In my development for theatrical sign language, I haven't made a list of songs that need to be signed on the beat and songs that don't. That's up to the directors and the interpreters to decide, but the music will tell you what's appropriate. I wouldn't death growl the national anthem. I wouldn't break dance to Total Eclipse of the Heart. Same thing with TSL. Like I said, it's more of an accent than a set of rules you would follow with a spoken language. But the one rule that anyone and everyone needs to follow when it comes to theatrical sign language is discipline and committing to the signs and taking it seriously. My entire research process for theatrical sign language and accessibility in theater was to understand whose voices were being ignored, how they were being ignored, and what able-bodied people can do to be better. I read an article by Ariel Baker Gibbs at HowlRound, and she said that as a kid, before seeing a show, her family would read the show before they saw it. She said, quote, "We would go out and buy 4 copies of the play we were seeing and go home, sit around the living room together, assign each other roles, and read it together. This would take a couple hours. Then a few days later, we'd go and see the play. I'd bring a flashlight and my copy of the script, and we'd tell the house manager that I was deaf and that I would be reading along as the play progressed." This seems like a wonderful bonding experience for her family, but as far as a good theatrical experience, it's a lot of work and these things shouldn't happen. Later on, Gibbs says, "One of my parents would sit next to me and help me follow along, keeping track of the parts they'd cut to streamline the script, and it turned into an elaborate game of jumping from scene to scene, over paragraphs, dodging lines here and there, and waiting a few minutes for the actors to catch up with the script. That is so much extra work she had to do in order to even enjoy a show, and that should be the job of the theater to accommodate her. It is the job of the theater to accommodate deaf audience members with accommodations. But we choose the easy way out, letting someone else take care of it. If you're going to do a show, theatrically signed or not, you have to commit to it. You have to show up to the rehearsals and learn the lines and do the dance, even if you're bad at it. But you can't decide not to try. If you don't try, the show won't be successful. But especially if you're using TSL, you have to commit to it. If you mess up, it's not like you're doing a dance and you land on the wrong foot. People in the audience will not be able to understand the story you are trying to tell. At some points during rehearsals for Hunchback, some people's signing started slipping in quality. They would repeatedly sign things incorrectly, and some people even stopped practicing altogether. That cannot happen. We all committed to the show when we learned the music and we did the dancing. If you can do all that, you can do TSL. TSL is not perfect. I'll have to go to college for both theater and American Sign Language for me to be able to even have the authority to make it an official part of the theatrical world, but I have to commit to doing it. If you don't provide quality accommodations, you are not giving your audience equal access. You are not accomplishing the goal of theater, to tell a story to as many people as possible. If I want this talk to have any success, I have to reach my audience. If all the world's a stage, then everyone needs to be able to understand the script. Thank you so much.